Blessed is our God at all times, both now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. Heavenly King, Consoler, Spirit of truth, present in all places and filling all things, the treasury of blessings and the giver of life, come and dwell within us, cleanse us of all stain, and save our souls, O good one. Welcome back to our Bible study, friends, here as we dive into our biblical texts for the 8th Sunday after the Holy Cross, known in among some of our jurisdictions as the 25th Sunday after Pentecost. But nevertheless, we share the text in common here. This is, I would say, looking at the biblical text we have in front of us, just a great example of why we're doing what we're doing, what our purpose is, that we're so familiar a lot of times with the gospel accounts and the epistles and so forth that are proclaimed, and yet we're familiar at a very much a superficial level. What we want to do is make sure that we aren't importing ideas into the text which are not there, and that we're taking the chance to slow down and make sure we understand exactly what is being said, the struggles that Christ faced in the proper historical context and so forth. So, and I can't think of a better one than this text here in Luke chapter 10, verse 25 through 37, the story of the merciful Samaritan, or the Good Samaritan, as it is commonly known. So let's jump right into the text here, Luke chapter 10, verse 25. Luke chapter 10, verse 25. At that time, behold, a certain lawyer got up to test Jesus, saying, Master, what must I do to gain eternal life? But he said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read? And he said, and he answered and said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, and with thy whole soul, and with thy whole strength, and with thy whole mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said to him, You have answered rightly. Do this, and you shall live. But he, wishing to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus answered, A certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell in with robbers, who after both stripping him and beating him went their way, leaving him half dead. But as it happened, a certain priest was going down the same way, and when he saw him, he passed by. And likewise a Levite also, when he was near the place and saw him, passed by. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came upon him, and seeing him was moved with compassion. And he went up to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and setting him on his own beast. He brought him to an inn and took care of him. And as he was leaving the next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I, on my way back, will repay you. Which of these 3, in your opinion, proved himself neighbor to the man who fell among the robber? And he said, The one who took pity on him. And Jesus said to him, Go and do as he did. You know, Father Sebastian, I always ask you right away, context. And, reading this text, I think is so oftentimes abused. Because, on the superficial level, who are we talking about here? We're talking about a Jew, right? The Levite. And we're talking about a Catholic priest, the priest, right? And we're talking about a Samaritan, who's the hippie, the nice guy walking down the street, right? So that's our normal context in which we read importing modern American notions and so forth, but obviously that's not what's going on. So let's unpack this text. Please go ahead and give us the context, first of all, not getting into the specifics about the priest and the Levite and so forth, but where does this story fit in the gospel story?
The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as we've talked about many times, have in the first half of their gospel is the Galilean ministry. Jesus, we know from John's gospel, and even looking at these Synoptic Gospels, particularly Luke, does seem to go back and forth between Judea and Galilee all throughout his 3-year ministry. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke primarily focus on his time spent in Galilee in those first 3 years. And then at the end, tell us the story about the journey to Jerusalem and that great final Passover. So in Luke's gospel, being one of the synoptics, we're here now toward the end of that Galilean ministry. Luke has an awful lot more he wants to say about Jesus and his trip to Jerusalem and what's going to happen there. But the Galilean ministry is now coming to a close here as we come into chapters 9 and 10 and 11 of his gospel, as he begins now to make that journey, just begins to make the preparations for the journey and start to head down toward Jericho by the Jordan Valley.
Okay, so the first guy that we encounter here is the lawyer, because we're going to unpack all of this. We're going to look at the lawyer, we're going to look at the priest, we're going to look at the Levite and so forth, the Samaritan. But the first guy here we meet is a lawyer, and he asks what would appear, again, to our modern American concepts to be a very strange question. We don't usually get lawyers walking around asking about eternal life. In fact, quite the opposite. So who is this guy in the biblical context? Who was a lawyer? What was a lawyer in those days?
Yeah, California lawyer is not what you think of as someone interested in eternal life. Just kidding for those lawyers out there in the audience. So, so this is an expert in the law, In other gospels, we hear him described as a scribe. A scribe was a professional copyist of the law, but because he spent his time copying the law, he was also the expert in the law. So a lawyer, an expert in law, but in this context, we're talking about an expert in the law of Moses, the Torah. So in some ways, he would be like a lawyer today, but their world, their culture was also very different. The laws we're talking about here, we're not talking about Roman law, we're talking about the law of Moses. And he comes up and asks Jesus this question: what must I do to enter into eternal life? He's testing Jesus. And so Jesus then asks him, well, tell me what you know.
So you said he's testing him. Maybe you can unpack that a little bit for us. Again, going back to that context of the gospel, because one of the things for me that has been tremendously helpful in reading the gospel accounts is understanding not only the story that's told, but the story behind the story. What's going on in the we've talked about this before, when Jesus, for example, gets in the boat and goes over to the other side, and he's in different political territories and stuff. That's the whole story behind the story that really helps understand why Jesus responds the way he responds. So the text tells us, and I think we miss that word you said. You're right. It says he tests him. It's not, the guy's not just coming forward and be like, I've set aside all the money I've made being a lawyer, suing the tobacco companies and so forth. That's not important to me anymore. I've got enough. I got my Mercedes-Benz. Now I want to know what it's going to take to get the real prize. I've got my mansion on the hill, and but that's not what's going on, right? The scribe, as you're saying, you're describing him. The scribe comes up and tests him. Why now in the gospel is this testing going on? And why does he ask Jesus a specific question of how is this a test to Jesus? What must I do to inherit eternal life?
Yeah, so a lawyer an expert in the law, asking a question like this is basically, that would be like, a professional mechanic walking up to, your average person on the street and say, what's the best way to change your oil? The mechanic has no interest in learning from the person how to change oil so that they can then better change their oil. This guy knows his stuff, right? And so to ask a question like this, he's putting Jesus to the test, and so Jesus then turns it around on him. This is how Jesus discusses these topics with these individuals. He's always teaching them, as we're going to see here. He's always teaching. They come up to test him, and he, rather than test them, turns it around and turns it into a teaching moment. And he does that by flipping the situation around on the person and now asking them a question. Think of how many times, why do your disciples eat with hands and wash? Jesus says, well, why do you, right? Or tell us if you are the Messiah. Well, first tell me about the baptism of John. Was it of heaven or of earth? So he's always teaching them, and he's directing them toward the answer to their original question. He's not dodging their question. He's helping them understand the real nature of their question, the answer that they may not have been expecting, and something a lot bigger than what what they're thinking about.
So, I would have expected Jesus to respond with, if he's really being tested, to quote the law, right? I would have expected him to quote the 10 Commandments. But he doesn't. I mean, he goes Christian, if you will, right? And he starts talking about love and daisies and all this stuff. Why doesn't he just quote the 10 Commandments?
So, yeah, I think that's what we would all expect. That's what I would expect Jesus to do here is, and when we think of the law of Moses or the commandments, what should I do to keep the commandments, right? We hear this in some of the other versions of the story. And, but Jesus doesn't, or the lawyer here in this context, the lawyer answers and doesn't give the 10 Commandments. He understands Jesus is asking for a lawyer's answer, right? He's not saying, okay, Sabbath school is over. Now tell me what you learned in Sabbath school. But rather, what does the law say about this topic? And what is the great commandment, as we get in other versions here? And so the lawyer does what a good lawyer would do. He summarizes the law, the Torah, rather than list some, the average Jew maybe walking down the street would list the 10 Commandments, but the lawyer knows the whole law. And he summarizes these by simply saying, look, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. This is a quote from Deuteronomy 6. Mm-hmm. And we, even today, modern Jews today still say this prayer. This is called the Shema prayer. And every morning, every evening, they say, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Every morning, every evening. But this is something that we know is central to Israel in the time of Jesus even, because we find references to this prayer in the Gospels. We find it in the Pauline epistles. And so it certainly was already understood to be kind of the statement of faith of the ancient Israelite. That is, there is only one God, Yahweh, and you shall worship him with your whole heart. That is not just part of it, and the rest of it off to Molech and Baal. So, but Jesus also then, he doesn't end there. He says, or here in this particular version, the scribe answers about the neighbor. You shall love your neighbors yourself. And that is being drawn from Leviticus in the Holiness Code. The Holiness Code was considered to be kind of the center of the Torah. You had the 5 books of Moses, the book of Leviticus was in the middle, and then the book of Leviticus you had the Holiness Code, chapters 17 through 22, which is called the Holiness Code because in chapter 19, verse 2, it says, you shall be holy as I, the Lord your God, am holy. And in chapter 19, so this is the heart of the heart of the heart of the Torah, it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall love the sons of your own people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so what the scribe has done here is picked 2 very important passages from the Torah, which also summarize the 10 Commandments. Because the 10 Commandments are divided, the first half, most importantly, love of God. Second half, love of fellow neighbor. And so the whole thing is summarized very beautifully in these 2 lines.
And then, so there's kind of like a chess game going on, basically, between the lawyer or the scribe and Jesus here. And so it seems to me that the guy's already like loaded. He knows exactly what he's going to say, and then to test Jesus. So he says, he goes exactly after this question of, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus launches into this story. And I'm guessing that this in this question, this testing continues, doesn't it? The scribe is trying to get underneath, hey, sweetie, how are you? Look at that. You want to say hi to everybody? Are you doing Bible study with us?
She just came in the door. Okay, hold on 1 second.
That's nice. Don't worry, everybody. We are proud of our families and happy to have them on board participating in the weekly Bible study. So we're going to leave this piece unedited just so you can see what usually goes on each week and what we usually edit out from our Bible study. Father Sebastian, we're staying live through this whole thing, and we're going to let people see that wonderful moment of, we're both married priests, and the reality of doing a Bible study as a married priest is, it just is what it is. So we're leaving that piece unedited, and I'm just going to ask you the question, Father, but who is my neighbor?
All right, so this is it's funny how the thing flows, because Jesus is being tested, and then he turns around and says, "Well, you tell me, what do you find?" The lawyer says, "Well," and he gives his answer, the good lawyer answer, and Jesus says, "Good answer. Now go and do that." And so the lawyer, well, I didn't get to test Jesus, so he says, "All right, well, but who's my neighbor?" Right? Who's my neighbor? Now, it's theoretically possible. The lawyer he's just ignorant of the law. Almost, this is like a mechanic not sure what type of oil to use when he's changing the oil in a car. I mean, this is like the basics, because this is in chapter 19 where he quoted, "You shall love your neighbors yourself." It's in that very chapter toward the end that it says, "And you shall love the foreigner who is among you as yourself, for you once were foreigners in Egypt." So what it means is that you must love your neighbor, and your neighbor does not only include the sons of your own people, which is the first part of chapter 19, where it mentions this, but toward the end of the chapter, it refers to the foreigner being loved as yourself. So therefore, your neighbor is your fellow human being, your fellow man, what a Greek, a Samaritan, an Egyptian, fellow Jew. All of them, a centurion, all of them must be loved as you love yourself. And so then Jesus, of course, now says, "Okay, you want to keep going, huh? Okay, well, let me tell you a story."
So now Jesus lays out three people here. We got to deal with each one of them very quickly. A Levite, a priest, and a Samaritan. So let's just walk through these to make sure we are all on the same page about who these guys are in the context of the gospel story. So we're not importing, the priest, and he's wearing his Roman collar, and he's going down the street, praying his rosary and so forth. Okay, so go ahead. Tell us who these guys are. First of all, the priest and the Levite. Again, even if I go back to my proper context of the Bible, I think I'm going to struggle. Most people are going to struggle and make this distinction, right? Obviously, I'm joking about the priest with his Roman collar on, but isn't a Levite a priest? Isn't a priest a Levite? I mean, I thought this was the whole deal with the Levitical priesthood. So go ahead.
So the context is everything. And you and I have been on that road many times, right? This is the road from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And it's a lonely place. There's nothing out there. And we've driven down on that bus. I always remember driving on the bus down. We always point out, the Bedouin out there in the hill with his goats or sheep. Nothing's out there. It's hot and dry. And so it's a lonely place. And you hear about a priest and Levite going down the same way, right? They're going down from Jerusalem down to Jericho and heading off to who knows where, Galilee or something. So they're leaving Jerusalem. These two individuals, a priest and a Levite, the people of Israel, 12 tribes. There was the tribe of Judah, from which the Jews come. The Jews are from Judah. Jews is just short for Judah. And then there are the Benjaminites. There are the Levites. You can go on the Gadites, etc. By the time we get to the first century, for the most part, the only clear remnants of any of these tribes left that still can identify themselves with a particular tribal group is the Levites, the people from Levi, the Benjaminites. Paul was a Benjaminite, and then the rest of them were Jews from the tribe of Judah. So the rest of the tribes, what happened to the rest of them? Well, those are the Samaritans. They are mixed people they're mixed in with other religions and other nations and things because of the Assyrian conquest of the region. By the time we get to the first century, they are a unified people who are just referred to as Samaritans because that northern kingdom was called Samaria at an earlier stage. And so Samaritans, meaning the rest of the tribes who have mixed in with the nations and are of varying qualities of religious adherence to the true faith, and certainly of varying qualities of genetics. That would be kind of the Jews' perspective on who they were. But the Levites, the tribe of Levi, they were the ones who were chosen by God at the golden calf, Exodus 32. They were the ones who in fact, offered themselves, volunteered to be with the Lord, and then they were the ones who went and brought the punishment upon those who had worshipped the golden calf by killing 3,000 of the Israelites that day. And so the tribe of Levi is set apart now as having a special role, and they end up being the ones who guard God's holiness. When they're encamped in the wilderness, the Levites encamp around like a hedge around the meeting tent and guard with their swords the holiness of God, his separateness, while the rest of the tribes are gathered beyond the Levites. And then the Levites then function also almost like what we call like deacons and subdeacons and things like that, sacristans and all that. They have all these functions in the Old Testament to help out the priests. Now, who are the priests? The priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. The priests come from a particular family line within the tribe of Levi, and that is the line of Aaron. Aaron was a Levite, and his descendants are the ones who are the priests. So we've got a son of Aaron, a Levi, a priest, a son of Aaron, who is also a Levite, walking down the road, and then we hear about a Levite. So if you want to kind of make it parallel to our modern experience, you could say maybe a priest was walking down the road, and then a deacon was walking down the road. Right. But it's a little different, certainly a little different.
Okay. So then the next, again, we need to go through these practicals, because again, we've heard this story so many times, but even this distinction you're making right now between priest and Levite is extremely helpful. And understanding who the Samaritans are is also extremely helpful. But then he goes and he takes them to this inn, as you're saying, rightly so, that this area is just kind of like it's barren desert, it's wasteland. We've seen guys out there with their goats and things even now today, on the hillside, just in the middle of nowhere, is Bedouin communities and things like that. It's quite amazing to see it, very much like it was in those days. Just off the side of the freeway. You said a funny thing. We're driving down in our bus through this barren desert wasteland, and here we are, in our bus, 2019, 2018, 2000, whenever we were there, 2016, and we're looking out there, and literally 10 feet off of the freeway is a living picture of what Jesus knew, very similar. So there he finds an inn, but then he says, look, he bound, even before he finds the inn, I guess, came upon him, seen, and was moved with compassion. He went up and he bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Not the normal thing we would have thought about, the antiseptic or some alcohol, swab his wounds to clean them and things like that. Oil and wine. Why does he pour oil and wine on his wounds?
So it's shocking here. I mean, this is really, for this lawyer to listen to this story would just really get under his skin, because a priest going down from Jerusalem doesn't want to touch this man, right? Why? The man's unclean, right? He's covered in blood, and the priest touches him, he'll become unclean. But it's interesting, Jesus tells a story, he's going down from Jerusalem, which means he's not headed to Jerusalem to perform his duty 2 weeks out of the year in the temple. He just went on vacation. He's going to go now. He's going home. He's done with his job. So if he were to touch this unclean man, the man has blood on him, all that means is that he would bathe when he got home, and then he'd be considered unclean until sunset, till the next day. That is, within just a few hours. By the time he got to Jericho, he would have bathed and he'd be clean again. So he's not going up to Jerusalem, but down from Jerusalem. If he was going up to Jerusalem, this would be, maybe because someone would say, well, he's supposed to remain clean. He won't be able to perform the law and do his sacrifices the way he's supposed to do on his job. But he's going down. He's done with his job. And then a Levite does the same thing. And now a Samaritan, who is the symbol of uncleanness for the Jew, for that lawyer. This is the symbol of uncleanness. A Samaritan goes down from Jerusalem now, and he has compassion on him. He pours on this oil and wine. This is the neosporin of the ancient world. The wine has a little bit of alcohol in it, and so it kills the microbes. And they'd figure this out, I guess, by then, that the wine, you put a little wine on something and it seems to kill, it makes the thing heal faster. They certainly didn't understand microbes, but they knew this worked. So then, and then he pours oil on it, wine and oil. And the oil this is olive oil. It's got a little bit of acid in there, but it's also, it creates basically, it's like a liquid Band-Aid. This is why neosporin, the equivalent there, the neosporin is the wine here, the antimicrobial. But the oil is like a liquid Band-Aid, and this is what we do with like neosporin. They put it in Vaseline. It's an oil, and it creates this physical barrier protecting the skin and the injured skin from the air and from other microbes getting in. So it's quite an ingenious fix. It's the neosporin of the ancient world.
So the text then says he gave 2 denarii to the innkeeper. About how much? Remind us about how much this is in those days.
So this is a denarius is a day's wage. So okay. 2 days' wage. This isn't just some coins out of his pocket. If we say today, I don't know what the average, where you live, what the average man's wage is. Say $100, $150, $200 for typically day labor or something. So we might say he's handed over at this hotel. So he's given him, a fair amount of money. This is especially for someone in the ancient world, handed over 2 days worth of wages. And most people back then didn't have bank accounts and savings and things like that. So he's taking from what he has. Yeah, and giving to this man, and he himself is probably now going to be a little short for a while.
Well, I was going to say, it'd been one thing if the priest or Levite had pulled this out, a guy who's accepted within society, and so forth. But here's a Samaritan, who most likely would have been struggling in the context, the societal context in which he lived, and here he just pulls out his wallet. I think it's a little bit of a reminder for us today. We pull out, I hate the donation basket, by the way, on Sundays. I really think we should get rid of it altogether because it's ridiculous. It's from a day, ages gone by. But we pull out our wallet. I don't have my wallet on me. I must have left it in the car. Somebody's probably stealing my money right now. But you pull out your wallet. What do you have left over? I'm serious about this. Stop for a second. Our San Diego Bible study down there, stop for a second. You're going to hit pause after I ask you this question. I want you to pull out your wallet right now in front of your Bible study group, and you show them what's inside it. Okay? Hit pause. All right. Now you're done. You're done pausing. Okay. I know what's inside your wallet, most likely, unless you happen to go to the bank. You're going to go out, Friday night or something like that. But the fact is we don't carry much in our wallets anymore. We got our plastic, got our credit cards and things like that. So the basket comes around on Sunday. I know I'm completely off course right now about what we're supposed to be talking about, but it's a little hobby horse of mine. I'm going to make use of it. So look, the basket goes by, we pull out our wallet, and what do we got? We give what's left over. And most time what's left over is like, you're lucky if you got $1 in your pocket. Okay, this is not the compassion of the Lord, which brings us back to the text of the compassion of this guy, the Samaritan, who is quite generous with what he has for a man he doesn't know, and in comparison to the Levite and the priest, the man is really filled with a desire and a love for this guy who's suffering. I would just say it's a challenge for us today to be challenged by this text to say, how would I have responded And how do I respond? Not how would I have responded like in this, okay, if this ever happened to me, which is not going to happen to me. Look, how do I respond? How am I compassionate and generous with those around me and with the ministry of the church?
Yeah, so, and I think that point is made well with this man's response. I mean, look at this. He doesn't say to Jesus, the Samaritan is the one who treated this man like his neighbor. But the lawyer can't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan because he knows he's been bested by Jesus here. Jesus has used the text that the lawyer brought up and proven that Jesus knows the law, right? He's being tested, and the lawyer tried to justify himself. Okay, let's see. All right, let me give him one final blow here. And Jesus tells him a parable, which is incredibly beautiful and makes the very point and answers the lawyer's question that even your fellow Samaritan is a neighbor. And look at this man, a Samaritan who, by Jewish standards, does not know the law, does not keep the law, is unclean. And here's a Samaritan who is following the holiness code in regards to his Jewish neighbor who would never have thought to do such a thing. So he cannot bring himself to say the Samaritan was acting as neighbor, but rather the man who showed compassion.
Yeah, I hadn't really, that's what this point is a really good one. We got to slow down and really, really let the text sink deeply and really consider. Listen, exactly what you said. Which of these three, in your opinion, this is the last of the lines of the gospel, proved himself neighbor to the man who fell among the robber? He said, the one who took pity on him. And Jesus said, go and do as he did. You're right. So he doesn't admit he's a Samaritan, just this guy over there. And what's also interesting, Jesus then really does throw down the hammer and says, you go and act like a Samaritan, which for that guy, like, whoa, and by God's providence, this is why I love, and in my work with the Office of Religious Education for the eparchy, I'm really big on the resurrectional troparia and getting our people to know them, because they are in some sense the gospel in a nutshell. And in this case, by God's providence, we're chanting the resurrectional troparia in tone 8. And you say, big deal. Well, big deal. Check this out. Listen to what we'll be singing this Sunday, just before we hear this gospel. You descended from on high, O compassionate one. And Jesus is the compassionate one. And consented to burial for 3 days, that you might free us from suffering, O Lord, our life and our resurrection. Glory to you. And in this text, saying Jesus is the compassionate one, the church is following upon a long tradition. It goes back to the earliest fathers of the church who commented on this text. It says, you know who the Samaritan is? The Good Samaritan is Jesus. The Good Samaritan is Jesus. And now we can go back. We're not going to do this right now, but I'm going to encourage our participants. You can go now back and reread this parable with Jesus there, the compassionate one. Jesus, the Good Samaritan. Jesus, the one who has been exiled, as the Samaritans were, rejected, as unclean, if you will. Jesus, the one who's willing to go into the worst situations of the dying and the sick, not worrying about whether he's going to be declared unclean, to do the very thing that the Lord wants for all of us, and that is to restore our neighbor to the full unity of society. And I mean society in its proper biblical context, the unity, entrance back into paradise, in which men and women live in communion with God, which brings us, my point of saying that, which brings us to our epistle very, very much. The church in her wisdom gives us this text from Ephesians chapter 4. So let's turn there very quickly, and just a couple of comments about this, because I think often as we hear the epistle, we hear the gospel. What's the connection? Well, the connection is, I would say, so obvious here if you just know a little bit about the context of Ephesians, about what's going on here. As you point out so many times, Father, that in order to understand the epistles of St. Paul, we've got to go back and get our context in Acts of the Apostles. You got to go back to to the story of Acts of St. Paul there, what happened to him when he was in Ephesus, to understand why he's writing what he's writing to the Ephesians. What's going on in Ephesus? That St. Paul is saying what he's saying about the unity of the community. Who are the characters in Ephesus that's going on? What's going on in the church that St. Paul is driven to say this? And of course, we hear all of it in the context of the gospel, which we just heard, about this fractured society in which 10 of the tribes have been really broken away, and now they're kind of not really considered pure anymore. They're not considered part of the community anymore. And then even a division within Judaism, within Judea, within the tribe of Judah, between and of the Levites, between the priests and the rest of them. So there's all these fractions, all this division going on in the community in the gospel account, and then also here in Ephesus. So let's read the text, Father, and I'm going to ask you to comment about that. What's going on in Ephesus? Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1 through 7. Brethren, I, the prisoner in the Lord, exhort you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling by which you were called, with all humility and meekness and with patience, bearing one another in love, careful to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. One body, one Spirit, even as you were called to a single hope in your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and throughout all and in all. But to each one of us, grace was given according to the measure of Christ's imparting. So, it's beautiful for me to hear this text. I was just reading this when I was there in Greece. Just actually last week, I was in Ephesus. And of course, I was also traveling along the way that St. Paul was traveling when he wrote this letter back to the Ephesians. And it's amazing because it puts, say, meat on the bones. It gives the context, the geographic context, to stand there and be able to see what's going on, to know what Ephesus looked like in the days of St. Paul, and the challenges that the early Christian community faced there. So, Father, I'm just going to turn it back to you again and ask you, what were those challenges? What was going on in Ephesus that St. Paul writes back and speaks about the unity of the church, the unity of the body?
Well, the Ephesian community is one that Paul knows well. He founded the community on his second journey when he passed through Asia Minor, through Turkey, goes through the region of Galatia again, and ends up now in Ephesus. And then from Ephesus, he moves into Macedonia and Greece and founds the community in Corinth.
But he stays there. Doesn't he stay there in Ephesus quite a while, Father? It's like he doesn't just stop by, but he there's a whole thing that blows up while he's there.
A lot of things going on there. He has to deal with Demetrius the silversmith, with the riots and things, and Paul's certainly causing some economic problems there regarding the idols. So the church in Ephesus, founded by Paul on his second journey, and then Paul goes there again on his third journey. And Ephesus is a very important city. It's the capital for the Roman Empire. It's the administrative capital for that region. It's a very, very important city and very big city. And Paul's there. Of course, this is where we see the churches growing in these large communities where there's a lot to draw from. And as you mentioned, what's the immediate context? Why is he saying these things? Well, Paul's in prison. This is one of the captivity epistles. So eventually Paul is put in prison and in Caesarea Philippi after his third journey, and eventually is sent off to Rome. That's that first captivity of Paul. During the captivity, somewhere between his time in Caesarea Philippi and his arrival in Rome, and somewhere in there, he writes a number of epistles, the captivity epistles, and Ephesians is one of them. He writes back to them, talking to them about offering yourself as a sacrifice for others, as Paul is doing at that very moment. It's in these epistles where Paul really meditates upon this idea of suffering for the body of Christ, suffering for your fellow Christian as Christ did for us, and really living out the life of Christ, even all the way to the cross for some of them. And in Ephesus, the church seems to have some problems there, as many of the churches did at this time. There were the Judaizer heresy there, telling where the Jewish Christians were telling the Gentile Christians they weren't really saved, they weren't really Christian, they weren't really gonna, if they really wanted to guarantee their salvation, they had to be circumcised and keep kosher, give up the bacon, all that stuff. And the Ephesians themselves, even Gentile Christians coming in, had all sorts of different ideas about salvation. Some of them had Gnostic ideas, some, if you had the secret information, and others didn't. And then there were the dualists who believed that the material world was evil and the spiritual world was good. So there are lots of different ideas that Paul has to deal with in the church in Ephesus. And throughout the epistle, we see him trying to, look, let's all come together here, and our unity is in Christ. Okay, and not to say, oh, it's okay to believe all these crazy ideas. No. Let's first begin with the fact that Christ is our unity, and now he begins to catechize them here in this epistle in chapter 4 about how that unity takes place and what is really important. It's not circumcision and kosher laws, all that. It's rather your baptism into Christ that makes you one, all one in him.
There's another level of something I picked up while I was there in Ephesus, also in Corinth and a number of other places, that the local community really, you have to imagine a situation in which the pagan world was so dominant in these places, so dominant, and the enticements of that pagan society were real. I mean, there were all these temples all around. You go see them today, the remnants of them. Pagan temples with full-blown temple prostitution going on, really not all that different than like kind of what we would see today down Main Street, the men's nightclub and things like that, with real sinful situations going on, and the enticements to engage in this stuff were real. So St. Paul talks a lot about what authentic love is. And it just strikes me here at the beginning of this text here, walk in a manner worthy of the calling by which you were called, bearing with one another in love, in authentic love. And the way we live our life, I just bring this up because that unity by which we, how should I say this? The unity we discover through baptism is a unity which must be lived out in our moral life also. And that for St. Paul, that unity is real. He says, look, there's one Spirit, one body. You were baptized into him, and you realize this. And I'm just, in our concluding remarks here today, I just say this is how important this is for us to realize too. We cannot just go to church on Sunday, stamp our time card and walk away and go back to our life and our business where we cheat people, go back to our computers in our living rooms where we, away from our spouse, we're looking at pornography. We go back to our life where we ignore the guy laying on the street bleeding. And I'll tell you, it's real. We got real suffering out there on the street, real people. And how oftentimes it's so much easier for us to turn our face away. I heard one biblical scholar once say that, and maybe Father Sebastian, you could confirm this if I'm correct, but it's one of the words in Hebrew for face is the same word for presence. To be present to someone is to show your face or something like that. How easy it is. It's so. I love the insights we get with understanding the original languages. Because to show your face really is to be present to somebody, which is why when we see somebody that's homeless and in need, the first reaction is turn our face away. If we turn our face away, we can ignore the commitment. But once we look somebody in the eyes, once we see them, there's this communion which is there. I remember the beautiful phrase from the book of Tobit, when Tobit thought he was dying. The last thing he said to his son, he said, "Son, do not turn your face away from any poor man, and God will not turn his face away from you." And I think I'm right in applying St. Paul's understanding of the community, that first that has to happen within our family, within our community. So oftentimes our communities are fractured, whether it be like in the gospel account of one tribe versus another tribe, right? Okay, they're Palestinian, I'm Lebanese, I don't talk to the Palestinians because I'm Lebanese. and they speak strange ways, and so we cannot let that happen with our community. They're Americans, I'm not. They're white people, I'm not. We can't let this kind of division go on in our community. We are placed in our community for one reason by God, and that is to be Christ to them, to be the Samaritan to the one who is suffering. And it's so easy to see the fault of our neighbor and to attack that fault. You and I were talking recently about some of the struggles we face in our communities. We see another person who may be different than us, and we see people in our community attacking them. No, our ministry within the body is to see another person's weakness, shortcomings, faults, to see the person, in a sense, they're lying in the curb bleeding. And rather than attack them for their fault or turn our face away and ignore them, we are called to be Christ, who turns his face, sees the need, and then discovers in that moment the communion which we have, that the other there who is in need is one with me because of our baptism, that you and I share a common spirit and a common life together. And when you suffer, I suffer. And when you're healthy, when you do well in the spiritual life, I benefit. The text is given to us today is so beautiful and reminds us of the original calling of our baptism, that we are literally plunged into, as the word baptized means, to be plunged into Christ and made one with him. And now my neighbor who is standing there next to me in the church is one with me. When I care for them, I care for myself. When I love them, I love myself. And ultimately, I love God.